Hey guys, Ronald again here with another Not Learn video. It's kind of a follow-up to that past financial kind of learning video back on the first channel, Learn. I said I was going to make a couple of specific videos about topics within what I talked about in that bigger video. So things like FIRE, REIT investing, MLPs, basic stock analysis. So this is going to be the FIRE video. Next is going to be the basic stock analysis. I'm also working on the corruption in government kind of video as well. That's going to be the next Learn video. This is going to be just a really relatively short, well, I'm hoping to keep it short, but who the fuck knows, video on just kind of like the FIRE movement and getting acquainted with what exactly that means. So FIRE is an acronym, F-I-R-E, that stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early, right? And so this kind of movement really began to go into the mainstream around 1992 with Your Money or Your Life, a book by Robin and Dominguez that kind of jump-started this into kind of the mainstream. And over time, that kind of has split off into a couple different philosophies of FIRE. I guess you could say it as philosophies of FIRE. As we'll kind of see in the end, you can almost think of these four different philosophies as milestones that you kind of reach, that you may or may not wish to reach on your journey to financial independence and maybe not retiring early, depending on what you want. And so those four types of FIRE are essentially fat FIRE, lean FIRE, barista FIRE, and coast FIRE. And we're kind of going to tackle them in that order. So to get a good idea of what exactly FIRE is, we'll just go into the classifications to begin with, and then the actual details of how one goes about becoming financially independent and potentially retiring early. So fat FIRE is basically when you plan on retiring with enough money to live a high-class lifestyle, or at least whatever you deem to be high class. So oftentimes people will think of this in terms of, well, having a yearly withdrawal income in retirement of maybe, say, $200,000 or more. And what that really means in practice is that you're going to want multiple millions invested so that the dividend income yield is a few $100,000 a year. That's essentially what fat FIRE is. And this is kind of the higher goalpost of the FIRE movement. Like if you can not only retire early, but also retire early with a really nice lifestyle, that's kind of optimum. The advantage to this kind of thing is that in terms of withdrawal rates and whether or not you're going to run out of money, this is often close to bulletproof, right? Because you tend to have so much money starting off that even if you have to cut into your principal a bit, that's fine. You just have so much cushion. Because even if you're living a fancy life, you could cut a great deal from that fancier, higher class life in times of difficulty, where for instance, if you were to run into some kind of sequence of returns risk, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on in the video. And it's relatively comfy. That's another advantage. A disadvantage is that oftentimes this kind of goal is really only possible if you start out with a reasonable income shovel to begin with. The other way of doing it is to just work a few more years than if you were to do just lean FIRE, which brings us into our next style of FIRE, which is lean FIRE. So lean FIRE is kind of the original FIRE concept, basically. And this is kind of associated with extreme frugality, basically. Really, I guess you could say pinching pennies, making your pennies go longer, basically. You get more for your money. You really, really try and squeeze all the value out of every dollar you get, which is what people refer to as the frugality. And you typically are aiming for a lower retirement income, and the way that you make that work is by having a smaller lifestyle overhead expenses while you're working. So you save, decrease your yearly expenses, get to a lifestyle that you think you can kind of maintain, and then you get basically 25 times plus that yearly income. You save that up, you invest it, and then you just live off that after you retire. Because you're aiming for a lower goal, you're going to more likely to reach that earlier, and it's a bit more achievable for people who don't necessarily start out with that larger income shovel. The advantage to this is that it's relatively achievable for people who aren't living totally paycheck to paycheck. this is an achievable form of financial independence for a lot of people. The disadvantage is that frugality doesn't really suit everyone. Not everyone wants to live a more frugal lifestyle. And it can be a little less safe without a nice cushion above the 4% rule if you run into something like sequence of returns. So if you're doing lean fire, you might be doing just exactly 25 times your yearly income, where there might not be as much of a cushion, and say you do a little bit more than that. Well, you're getting a slightly less lean fire, right? And so lean fire makes us a couple of those assumptions that, you're not going to have as much financial hardship. You have less of a cushion. That's kind of one of the drawbacks there. Then that brings us to barista fire. So you can think of this as kind of a way of retiring early while retaining part-time work. Some others have alternatively defined this as essentially retiring early while your spouse works and they pick up the slack that way. But in general, barista fire means having enough to retire and doing so. That's important just because of the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is coast fire, which is very, very, very similar. It's just that coast fire, when you're coasting, you don't have enough to retire. You're coasting, but you're still working full time. Barista fire is called barista fire because oftentimes the part-time job that you take while you're fire, the barista style, is something that you might do for benefits of some kind. Like, for instance, the original one is Starbucks, right? Starbucks offers healthcare to its part-time employees. And so if you were doing barista fire and you had a part-time job at Starbucks, you also get healthcare. And so that's the type of thing you often take advantage of when you're doing barista fire. What that means in practice is that you often save up enough so that dividends will defray a large part of your daily costs. And that way you can just take meaningful work that you enjoy, to make up the difference, because you don't have to worry about having a large salary or a large monetary return on that work, which gives you a bit more flexibility in theory. And you don't have to support your lifestyle with just that job. An advantage of that is that you spend less time in the workforce overall. But the disadvantage of that is that it's not really fire, I guess. You'd have to, in order to actually retire early or retire at all, you'd have to do a little bit above and beyond simply making up the difference of your lifestyle costs with that job. You'd have to actually save on top of that. So straight barista fire is in a way not really even fire. And you could almost kind of say that about coast as well. Because really, then we may as well move on to the next one. So coast fire is when you save enough money to a point where if you never contributed again to your retirement account, the compound interest effect would make sure that you have enough to retire when you are ready to retire. That's different from barista fire, like I said, because in this case, you're still essentially working full time. And so you can think of these, like I said, as kind of goalposts, right? Coast fire is if you get to this bare minimum and then you just let it go in the market after that. Barista fire is if you get to a certain minimum and then you keep kind of working a little bit on top of that. And then lean fire, you're going for full financial independence. You're going for full retiring early, but you're not necessarily going too far past what you absolutely need. Whereas with fat fire, you've saved up even more, right? And so this is a spectrum of goal savings to income ratio as well, right? So your goal savings will be higher in terms of the ratio of that to your current income. And so, like I said, with FIRE, the movement, often they're trying to save as much as 70% or more of their yearly income. Fat FIRE, potentially even more than that, or less than that, depending on how you're approaching it. It depends on how much you're actually making to begin with. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this concept of like the 4 and 3% rules. I did go into a certain amount of detail on this in my first video on Learn about the credit and stock market. But basically, there's this thing called the Trinity study. They looked into how much you'd have to save and at what's withdrawal rate yearly once you've retired. What is safe to withdraw in retirement so that you don't run out of money. You want to outlive your money in retirement. Right? And so basically they said that you would want to save up something like 25 or 30 times your yearly income and then withdraw 4% of that every year. Now, this assumes that you're going to be retired a certain number of years. If you retire early, you're going to need more than that, right? And so people that are doing FIRE often follow something more like a 3% rule. Now, you gotta really kind of be careful about this, as using this as like a dogma, right? Because the effects of inflation and things like the current low interest rate environment can undermine this rule of thumb. Because remember, we've got to return to this concept of nominal and real returns, right? So say that you gain $4. Well, that's say over like $4. That's a weird example, but $40, whatever, over 4 years. Okay. That might be $40 absolute, but then say there's a certain amount of inflation. If you account for inflation, maybe you come down to like $30. 40 is essentially your nominal returns, and 30 would be your real returns. Real is essentially how much value that same amount of money comes to if you adjust for inflation, as I said in my previous video. And so an example of the math behind this is essentially that if you put $1 million into an account and subjected it to 2% inflation for 25 years, after 25 years, if you simply, just kept that $1 million as is, you really have the buying power equivalent to about $600,000 of that starting money. Now, if you had 3% inflation, that would only be $470,000, right? And so 2% of 1 million is $20,000. This is really the low end of what you need to beat inflation, right? So if you were to just keep contributing about $20,000 a year, you could keep that $1 million up to pace with inflation. Now, the average inflation rate over the past couple of decades has been about 2.46%, or about $24,600 a year to keep 1 million as 1 million. That is the actual rate that you would have had to do over the past couple of decades. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can kind of get around this inflation risk. One interesting tool that you can use to kind of, adjust to it is TIPS, right? These are treasuries. Treasuries are essentially government bonds. So treasuries that track inflation and deflation. This way your money retains its value with inflation. Of course, the downside to that is that it also tracks deflation. Money in a TIPS will actually lose value during deflationary periods. Of course, you won't beat inflation either. They track inflation. So now we got to talk about things like sequence of returns risk, right? Sequence of returns risk is the risk of basically the market going down for longer than you can stay solvent, essentially. This refers kind of to the idea of like market crashes. If the market crashes and you're about to retire, the market is assumed that it's going to go back up over time, but you may not have that kind of time. If you're 70 years old and you have your retirement account, you're about to start retiring, if your portfolio goes down 40%, you don't have the lifespan to potentially make that back and keep growing, right? And if your account is way, way low when you start withdrawing from it, you are losing money with every single withdrawal, massive amounts of money, right? Because you're selling low, you're selling low. You bought high and now you're selling low. It's the opposite of what you want to do. That is a very bad case scenario in retirement, and prolonged market crashes can have real effects on your solvency. And make you more likely to have to do something uncomfortable, like, for instance, getting back into the workplace after potentially decades outside of the workplace. And then, of course, there's that issue of life expectancy, right? If you plan on living a while and being retired a while, you got to make sure that your money outlives you. And that can be difficult to do, especially if you accidentally end up living longer than you thought you would. That can make things difficult. And then there's the idea of dollar cost averaging, right? So dollar cost averaging is something that we kind of referred to in my previous video. You just kind of put money consistently into the market so that you don't have to time the market. You just spend good time in the market. And as the market goes up and down, your volatility risk kind of evens out, kind of. And this mitigates the risk of that volatility, right? Sometimes you're buying higher, sometimes you're buying a little lower, and it kind of averages out. Well, there's a negative dollar cost averaging effect on the other side, essentially. So you're also kind of dollar cost averaging away your potential returns as well if your account changes in value afterwards. And like I mentioned earlier, there's always the danger of having to re-enter the workforce decades after having been out of it. Now, I'm going to give you my personal kind of plan going forward for my own idea of financial independence, retire early. I'm not overly interested in retiring early. So that's really my first point. I have no interest in really retiring. But financial independence, I think, is a worthy goal. It's probably something that in my mind, I think most people who are capable of doing it should make some effort towards doing it. It seems like the type of thing that would make your life overall a little better. Not everybody can, but I think lots more people can than they think. I like to work as long as possible, partly because I like what I do, but then also my circadian rhythm and all that stuff gets thrown off if I don't have enough work for too long. If something were to happen, though, and I was out of work for a prolonged period of time, I want to know that it won't affect me, right? I want to be able to walk away from something. I want to be able to feel safe, even if my job were to, something were to happen to my job. If the company I'm working for goes under or something like that, right? Even if I were to be unemployed for an extended period of time, which is relatively unlikely if you're a doctor, but even if that were to happen, I want to know I'll be fine. And so the concept that I kind of like the most is kind of a mix between fat fire and coast fire. Fat FI, I suppose, financial independence and coast. So I'd like to save up a good bit early on, as much as possible so that there's a more of an appreciable compounding effect. That compounding effect should start to be noticeable once we start getting the personal investment portfolio above, say, the 100,000 to 200,000 range, but won't be super significant until we start to get a couple times more than that. Realistically, I'm hoping to get it to around $500,000 or so during my aggressive saving phase. So I'm going to just get that nice, convenient income shovel of being a doctor and kind of pile on a little bit for a couple of years. And after that, I'll probably start to coast a little bit more. I'll still keep dollar cost averaging in regularly. It's not like I'm going to stop, but I'm not going to be as aggressive with the investments. I'll be above the inflation rate minimum at the very least. So I won't be quite fully coasting, but I won't really be paying a whole lot of attention either. And when and if the time comes to dip into that dividend income, there should be enough to cover the basics for years. And I consider that a very effective cushion, which is kind of what I'm going for. It's kind of like barista fire while working full time, basically. And that's kind of my take on fire. Are you guys interested in that at all? Or any of you having, individual plans that you have made to try and get to financial independence? And what are your thoughts on retiring early? Once again, this has been Ronald with Not Lern. And please like and subscribe. Thank you.